Steve Rogers lived a simple life in the suburbs of Ohio. His days were predictable but satisfying. Every morning he woke up early, drank a cup of coffee while reading the newspaper, and then headed outside to take care of his lawn. Steve took pride in his home, especially the backyard where he had built a small swimming pool all by himself. It wasn't anything fancy, just a basic above-ground pool, but it meant a lot to him. It was a place where he could relax after a long day, cool off during hot summers, and feel like he had accomplished something tangible. On this particular Saturday, the sun was shining brightly, and the air smelled fresh after an overnight rain. Steve had spent most of the morning mowing the lawn, trimming bushes and pulling out weeds that had crept into the cracks of his driveway. By noon, sweat dripped down his forehead, and his shirt clung to his back. Deciding he deserved a break, Steve walked to the shed at the side of the house, grabbed his swimsuit, and changed quickly. Within minutes, he was stepping into the refreshing water of his pool. The sensation of cool water against his skin felt amazing. Steve floated lazily, letting the stress of the week melt away. For a moment, everything seemed perfect, but perfection rarely lasts long in the real world, and Steve was about to learn that lesson the hard way. As Steve floated in the pool, he noticed movement near the edge of his property. Two people were walking toward him, their footsteps crunching softly on the gravel path that bordered his yard. At first glance, they looked official. Both wore dark blue uniforms with badges pinned to their chests. One carried a clipboard, and the other held what appeared to be a folder filled with papers. They stopped just short of the white picket fence separating Steve's yard from the sidewalk. "Mr. Rogers?" the taller of the two asked. His voice was firm but polite. Steve sat upright in the pool, water dripping from his hair. "Yes, that's me," he replied cautiously. "Can I help you?" The man nodded, stepping closer. "We're here on behalf of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. My name is Officer Daniels, and this is my colleague, Officer Klein." Steve frowned. Willow Creek was the name of the neighborhood, but he hadn't heard much about its homeowners association since moving in 5 years ago. As far as he knew, he hadn't done anything wrong. Still, seeing two uniformed individuals show up, unannounced, made him uneasy. "What's this about?" Steve asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. Officer Daniels flipped open the folder in his hands and glanced at the contents. "It has come to our attention that you have been engaging in activities that violate Section 7.3 of the HOA agreement, specifically excessive recreational use of your property." Steve blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. Excessive recreational use? What does that even mean? Daniels adjusted his glasses and spoke slowly, as if explaining something to a child. Section 7.3 states that residents must adhere to community standards regarding noise levels, visual aesthetics, and overall conduct. Your frequent use of the swimming pool falls under excessive recreational activity. We've received multiple complaints from neighbors who find it disruptive. Steve couldn't believe what he was hearing. Disruptive? I'm just swimming. In my own pool. How can that possibly bother anyone? Klein chimed in, her tone slightly less patient than Daniel's. It's not just about today, Mr. Rogers. Our records indicate that you've used the pool almost daily for the past month. That kind of behavior sets a bad example for the rest of the community. A bad example? Steve repeated incredulously. He wanted to laugh, but the situation was too absurd. Are you serious right now? This is my house, my pool, and my property. I pay taxes on it every year. Who exactly complained? Daniels hesitated before answering. Unfortunately, we can't disclose the names of those who filed complaints. However, we are required to enforce the rules set forth by the HOA. As such, we must issue you a fine of $500. Steve stared at them, his jaw tightening. $500? For swimming in his own pool? It felt like some sort of twisted joke. He climbed out of the water, ignoring the fact that he was soaking wet, and stood face to face with the officers. "This is ridiculous," Steve said, firmly. "I didn't sign any agreement when I bought this house. No one ever told me there were these ridiculous rules." Daniels shrugged apologetically. The HOA agreement is part of the standard documentation included with every property sale in Willow Creek. If you didn't read it thoroughly, that's unfortunate, but it doesn't excuse non-compliance. Steve clenched his fists, resisting the urge to argue further. He knew yelling wouldn't solve anything, but the unfairness of the situation burned inside him. "Fine," he muttered through gritted teeth. "Give me the ticket or whatever it is. I'll deal with it later." Daniels handed him a slip of paper detailing the fine and the alleged violation. "You have 30 days to pay. Failure to do so will result in additional penalties." With that, the two officers turned and left, leaving Steve standing alone in his yard, dripping wet and seething with anger. After a few moments, Steve forced himself to calm down. Getting upset wouldn't change anything. Instead, he decided to call Emily Davis, an old friend from college who worked as a lawyer. Though they hadn't spoken in years, Steve hoped she might offer some guidance. "Hey, Em," he said when she answered the phone. "Sorry to bother you, but I need your advice." Emily sounded surprised but happy to hear from him. "Steve, long time no see. What's going on?" He explained the situation, starting with the unexpected visit from the HOA officers and ending with the outrageous fine. To his relief, Emily didn't dismiss his concerns. Instead, she listened carefully and offered thoughtful suggestions. "Well, first things first," she said. "You should definitely appeal the fine. File a formal complaint with the HOA board and request a review of the decision. Sometimes these organizations make mistakes, and appealing is your best shot at getting justice." Steve nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Okay, I can do that, but what if they don't budge? What if they double down on this nonsense?" "In that case," Emily replied, "we might need to escalate. There are laws protecting homeowners from unreasonable restrictions, especially when they involve private property. Worst case scenario, we take them to court, but let's cross that bridge only if we have to." Feeling slightly more optimistic, Steve thanked Emily for her help and promised to keep her updated. After hanging up, he sat down at his kitchen table and drafted a letter addressed to the HOA board. In clear, concise language, he outlined why he believed the fine was unjustified and requested a meeting to discuss the matter further. Sending the letter gave Steve a small sense table. Steve spent the rest of the day trying to make sense of what had happened. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being treated unfairly. After sending off his appeal letter to the HOA board, he decided to talk to someone who might understand how he felt. That someone was Laura Bennett, his neighbor across the street. Laura was in her late 60s, a retired school teacher with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue. She had lived in Willow Creek for over 20 years and knew everyone in the neighborhood. When Steve knocked on her door, she greeted him warmly, though she could tell right away that something was bothering him. "Come in, Steve," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. "You look like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders." Steve sighed as he sat down on her couch. "I wish it were just the world, Laura. It's the HOA. They fined me $500 for swimming in my own pool." Laura raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Swimming? That doesn't sound right." "What did they say?" Steve explained. "Everything. The officers showing up, the vague rule about excessive recreational activity, and the fine itself." By the time he finished, Laura was shaking her head in disbelief. "They're really reaching this time," she muttered. "But trust me, you're not the first person they've targeted. A few months ago, I got a warning because I planted marigolds outside my front porch. Apparently, orange flowers clash with the community aesthetic." Steve stared at her, astonished. "Are you serious? Marigolds, that's insane." Laura nodded grimly. "Oh, it gets worse. Last year they tried to tell Mr. Peterson down the block that he couldn't park his RV in his driveway overnight. The man owns the thing. It's not like he's renting it out or anything, but according to the HOA, it's an eyesore. The more Laura talked, the angrier Steve became. It wasn't just about him anymore, it was about the entire neighborhood. The HOA seemed determined to control every little detail of people's lives, no matter how trivial or absurd. "We need to do something about this," Steve said firmly. "There has to be a way to fight back." Laura leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "I agree, but we'll have to be smart about it. If we go charging in without proof, they'll just brush us off. We need evidence. Something concrete to show that the HOA isn't acting in good faith. Steve frowned. Evidence like what? Laura smiled faintly. Let's start by digging into their finances. I've heard rumors that Richard Monroe, the HOA president, has been using association funds for personal vacations. If we can prove that, we'll have leverage. The idea of investigating the HOA sounded risky, but Steve didn't care. He was tired of feeling powerless. How do we even begin something like that, he asked. Well, Laura replied, we'll need help. Jake Miller, the kid who lives 2 doors down from you, he's always tinkering with computers. He might know how to track financial records online, and if we keep this quiet, we won't tip them off. Steve agreed, and together, they came up with a plan. Later that evening, Steve approached Jake, a college student with messy brown hair and a knack for technology. At first, Jake seemed hesitant to get involved, but when Steve explained the situation, he quickly warmed up to the idea. This could be fun, Jake said with a grin. If Monroe's dirty, we'll find out. Just give me a few days to set things up. True to his word, Jake got to work immediately. Using public records and clever web searches, he uncovered several suspicious transactions linked to the HOA's account. One stood out in particular, a hefty payment made to a luxury resort in Florida, around the same time Monroe had supposedly attended a conference for homeowners associations. When Jake showed Steve and Laura the findings, they were stunned. This is gold, Laura said, her voice tinged with excitement. With this kind of evidence, we can expose him. But before they could act, the HOA struck back. A week after submitting his appeal, Steve received another notice in the mail. This time it wasn't just a fine. It was a list of new restrictions placed on his property. Barbecues were banned, lawn decorations were prohibited, and he was only allowed to use his backyard between the hours of 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. Steve read the letter twice, his anger growing with each word. They're punishing me for standing up to them, he muttered under his breath. Laura, who happened to stop by that afternoon, shared his outrage. They're trying to intimidate you, she said. But they've underestimated you and us. Determined not to back down, Steve continued defying the rules. He hosted small gatherings in his backyard, inviting neighbors to join him for barbecues and casual chats. Word spread quickly, and soon, others began joining the cause. Even those who hadn't previously cared about the HOA started questioning its authority. One evening, as Steve grilled burgers for a group of neighbors, Laura pulled him aside. We need to take this further, she said. People are ready to listen. Let's draft a petition demanding transparency and accountability from the HOA. Steve nodded. Do you think anyone will sign it? I know they will, Laura replied confidently. Everyone's sick of Monroe's nonsense. All they need is someone to lead the charge. Over the next few days, Steve and Laura went door to door, gathering signatures from residents eager for change. The response was overwhelming. By the end of the week, they had collected nearly 100 names, far exceeding their expectations. Armed with the petition and Jake's evidence, Steve felt a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time since the ordeal began, he believed they had a real chance of making a difference, but deep down he knew the hardest part was yet to come. Exposing Monroe wouldn't be easy, and the HOA wouldn't go down without a fight. Still, Steve refused to give up. He had started this battle alone, but now he had allies, friends and neighbors who shared his frustration and desire for justice. Together, they were ready to take on the HOA and reclaim their freedom, one step at a time. With the petition signed and Jake's evidence ready, Steve, Laura, and their growing group of allies began planning their next move. They knew they had to act carefully. Richard Monroe and the HOA board weren't going to give up without a fight. But Steve also realized that this was no longer just about him or his pool. It was about standing up for everyone in the neighborhood who had been bullied into silence by unfair rules and unnecessary fines. The first step was to organize a meeting where they could share what they'd discovered with the rest of the community. Steve suggested hosting it in his backyard since it had become a kind of unofficial headquarters for their cause. Laura agreed, but insisted they keep things low-key to avoid drawing attention from the HOA before they were ready. On a cool Friday evening, neighbors trickled into Steve's yard, curious about the sudden buzz surrounding the HOA. Some came out of solidarity, others simply wanted answers. By the time everyone settled around the pool area, nearly 30 people had gathered, a mix of families, retirees, and young professionals, all united by frustration. Steve stood near the edge of the pool, clutching the clipboard with the petition. His heart raced as he looked out at the faces staring back at him. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, but tonight, he didn't have a choice. "Thanks for coming," Steve began, his voice steady, despite his nerves. "I know we're all busy, so I'll get straight to the point. A lot of us have been treated unfairly by the HOA. Whether it's ridiculous fines, stupid rules, or plain harassment, we've all felt powerless at some point." He paused, letting his words sink in. Several people nodded in agreement, murmuring softly among themselves. "But here's the thing," Steve continued. "We don't have to take it anymore. Over the past few weeks, we've been digging into the HOA's activities, and we've uncovered something big. Jake, can you show them?" Jake stepped forward, carrying his laptop. He placed it on a small folding table and turned the screen toward the crowd. On it was a spreadsheet detailing suspicious transactions made using HOA funds. One entry stood, "Out," a payment of several $1,000s to a luxury resort in Florida, coinciding with Richard Monroe's supposed business trip. "This isn't just speculation," Jake explained. "These are actual records pulled from public filings. It looks like Monroe has been using our money to fund vacations under the guise of work-related expenses." Gasps rippled through the group. For many, this was the proof they needed to confirm what they'd long suspected, that Monroe cared more about himself than the community. Laura took over from there, her tone calm but firm. "This is why we need to demand accountability. We've drafted a petition calling for transparency within the HOA. So far, almost 100 residents have signed it. Our goal is to present this to the board and insist on changes. If not, we'll go public." The idea of going public resonated with the crowd. Someone suggested posting the evidence online, while another neighbor offered to contact local news outlets. The energy in the air shifted from frustration to determination. People started talking over each other, brainstorming ways to expose Monroe and force reform. As the meeting wrapped up, Steve felt a surge of hope. For months, he'd felt alone in his fight against the HOA. Now he had an entire team behind him, ready to take action. Still, he knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Confronting the HOA meant stepping onto dangerous ground, especially since Monroe wasn't likely to admit defeat quietly. Over the next few days, the group worked tirelessly to prepare for their showdown with the HOA. Jake enhanced the evidence, organizing the financial data into a clear, easy-to-understand presentation. Laura wrote a formal complaint letter addressed to the board, attaching copies of the petition and the incriminating documents. Meanwhile, Steve reached out to additional neighbors, encouraging them to attend the upcoming board meeting where they planned to confront Monroe directly. The day of the meeting finally arrived. Steve dressed in his best button-down shirt, feeling both nervous and excited. He met Laura and Jake outside the community center where the HOA held its sessions. Dozens of residents had already gathered, holding signs that read, "Enough is enough," and "Transparency now." The turnout was better than anyone had anticipated. Inside the building, the atmosphere was tense. The HOA board members sat at a long table at the front of the room, looking uncomfortable as the crowd filed in. Richard Monroe, seated in the center, glanced around uneasily, clearly sensing trouble. When the meeting began, Monroe tried to stick to the usual agenda, discussing mundane topics like landscaping guidelines and parking permits. But Steve wasn't going to let him dodge the real issue. As soon as there was a break for questions, Steve stood up, gripping the petition tightly. "Excuse me, Mr. Monroe," Steve said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Before we move on, I'd like to address something important." Monroe hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Go ahead, Mr. Rogers. Steve cleared his throat and stepped forward. Many of us here today feel that the HOA has overstepped its bounds. You've fined us for trivial reasons, imposed unreasonable restrictions, and ignored our concerns. But worst of all, it seems you've been misusing our money. Murmurs erupted throughout the room as Steve handed copies of the evidence to each board member. Monroe's face turned pale as he flipped through the pages, his hands trembling slightly. I think the community deserves an explanation, Steve concluded, his voice ringing with conviction, and if you can't provide one, maybe it's time for new leadership. The room erupted into applause and Monroe struggled to regain control. He stammered, attempting to deny the accusations, but the damage was done. The evidence spoke for itself, and the crowd wasn't buying his excuses. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that the tide had turned. Neighbors who had once feared speaking out now demanded change. And though the battle wasn't over yet, Steve knew they had struck a critical blow against Monroe and the corrupt system he represented. As Steve walked home that night, flanked by Laura and Jake, he couldn't help but smile. What had started as a simple act of defiance, swimming in his own pool, had sparked a movement that was bringing the entire neighborhood together. Whatever happened next, Steve felt certain of one thing. They were on the right side of this fight. The community center buzzed with energy as residents packed into every available seat. Some stood along the walls or leaned against chairs, their faces filled with anticipation. This wasn't just another routine HOA meeting. It was a reckoning. Steve Rogers stood near the podium, flanked by Laura Bennett and Jake Miller. The petition they'd worked so hard on lay neatly stacked beside them, ready to be presented. Richard Monroe called the meeting to order, his voice shaky but authoritative. Let's begin, he said, glancing nervously at the crowd. We'll address any concerns after we review the standard agenda. But no one was interested in landscaping guidelines or parking rules tonight. As soon as Monroe finished speaking, Steve stepped forward, drawing everyone's attention. Excuse me, Mr. Monroe, Steve said firmly. His voice carried across the room, silencing side conversations. There's something more urgent we need to discuss. Monroe frowned, clearly irritated. Mr. Rogers, if you have a concern, please wait your turn. This can't wait, Steve replied without hesitation. He held up the folder containing Jake's findings and the signed petition. We've uncovered evidence that you've been misusing HOA funds for personal gain. The residents of Willow Creek deserve answers. A murmur rippled through the audience. People exchanged shocked glances, whispering to each other about what Steve had just said. Monroe's face turned red, and he gripped the edge of the table, tightly. That's outrageous, Monroe snapped. These accusations are baseless and slanderous. I demand proof. Steve didn't hesitate. He walked over to the table and handed copies of the financial records to each board member. Then turning back to the crowd, he gestured for Jake to project the data onto a screen set up at the front of the room. Jake tapped a few keys on his laptop, and the suspicious transactions appeared in bold letters. Payments to luxury resorts, expensive restaurants, and even designer clothing stores, all billed to the HOA account. Gasps echoed throughout the room as people absorbed the damning evidence. Laura stepped forward next, her tone calm but cutting. This isn't speculation, Mr. Monroe. These are public records. You've abused your position for far too long, and it stops now. Monroe tried to defend himself, stammering excuses. These expenses were approved. They were necessary for business purposes. No one believes that, interrupted a voice from the crowd. Heads turned to see Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman who rarely spoke out. You've been living large off our money while bullying us with ridiculous fines. It ends tonight. Her words sparked a chorus of agreement. Neighbors began shouting questions and demands, their voices rising in unison. The once orderly meeting descended into chaos. Monroe looked desperate, sweat forming on his forehead as he glanced around for support from the other board members. To his dismay, they avoided eye contact, clearly unwilling to back him up. Jake seized the moment. Quietly filming the entire scene with his phone, he uploaded snippets live to social media under a hashtag Laura had suggested. Expose Willow Creek HOA. Within minutes, the video went viral, attracting hundreds of views and comments from outraged residents and curious outsiders alike. Seeing the tide turning decisively against him, Monroe attempted to regain control. "Enough!" he bellowed, slamming his hand on the table. "If you persist in spreading lies, I'll sue all of you for defamation." His threat only fueled the fire. Steve stepped closer to the table, his expression unwavering. "Go ahead, Mr. Monroe. Sue us. But remember, one call to the state regulators and they'll investigate these transactions themselves. Do you really want that kind of scrutiny?" Monroe froze, his confidence crumbling. He knew Steve was right. If the authorities got involved, the scandal would explode beyond Willow Creek, ruining his reputation entirely. For a moment, silence fell over the room as everyone waited to see what Monroe would do next. Finally, he slumped back in his chair, defeated. "Fine," he muttered bitterly. "I'll resign as president effective immediately, but don't think this absolves you of breaking the rules." Before anyone could respond, several board members followed suit, standing up and announcing their resignations. One by one, they left the room, leaving behind an empty table and a stunned audience. Cheers erupted from the crowd. People clapped, hugged, and high-fived each other, celebrating their victory. Laura raised her hands to quiet them down. "This is just the beginning," she reminded everyone. "We still need to elect new leadership and rewrite the HOA rules to make sure nothing like this happens again." Steve nodded in agreement. "We'll hold elections next week. Until then, let's focus on rebuilding trust and making Willow Creek a better place for everyone." As the meeting wrapped up, neighbors lingered to thank Steve, Laura, and Jake for their courage. Many promised to stay involved, eager to ensure lasting change. Even those who hadn't initially supported the cause admitted they were glad someone finally stood up to the HOA. Later that night, as Steve sat by his pool reflecting on the day's events, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. What started as a simple act of defiance had grown into something much bigger, a movement that united the entire neighborhood. He realized that fighting back wasn't just about winning. It was about inspiring others to believe they could make a difference too. In the distance, laughter drifted from nearby yards where neighbors gathered to celebrate their newfound freedom. For the first time in years, Willow Creek felt like a true community, and Steve knew, whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The days following the dramatic HOA meeting were filled with excitement and optimism in Willow Creek. For the first time in years, neighbors greeted each other warmly, sharing stories about how much they had disliked Richard Monroe's leadership. It was clear that the scandal had brought the community closer together, sparking conversations and friendships that might never have happened otherwise. Steve Rogers found himself at the center of it all. People stopped him during morning walks to thank him for standing up to the HOA. Some even joked that he should run for president of the new board. At first, Steve laughed off the idea. He didn't see himself as a leader, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized he could help steer the neighborhood toward real change. With Laura's guidance, Steve organized another meeting to discuss the next steps. This time, the gathering was far friendlier than before. Held in his backyard, it felt less like a formal event and more like a neighborhood celebration. Families brought food and drinks, kids played by the pool, and everyone seemed eager to contribute ideas for improving Willow Creek. "We've got a clean slate now," Steve said, addressing the group. He stood near the picnic table, holding the same clipboard he'd used during the confrontation with Monroe. "But we can't just sit back and hope things improve. We need to elect new leaders who will listen to us and make decisions based on what's best for everyone." Laura nodded in agreement. "And we need to rewrite the HOA rules," she added. "No more nonsense about excessive recreational activities or banning orange flowers. Let's create guidelines that actually make sense." The crowd murmured in approval. Someone suggested forming committees to handle specific issues such as landscaping, safety, and community events. Others proposed setting up a system where residents could vote on major decisions instead of leaving everything to a small group of people. Jake Miller, ever the tech-savvy helper, raised his hand. "What if we set up an online platform where everyone can share feedback and stay updated?" That way no one feels left out. That's a great idea, Steve replied. We'll keep everything transparent so there's no room for corruption or secrets. As the discussion continued, volunteers stepped forward to take on roles within the temporary organizing committee. Laura agreed to oversee the election process, ensuring it was fair and open to anyone interested in running. Jake offered to build the online platform, promising to have it ready within a week. Even Mrs. Thompson, who rarely involved herself in neighborhood matters, volunteered to chair the gardening committee, determined to bring beauty back to Willow Creek without restrictive rules. Over the next few days, preparations for the election moved quickly. Flyers were posted around the neighborhood inviting residents to nominate candidates or put their own names forward. To Steve's surprise and slight discomfort, his name appeared on the list almost immediately. Several neighbors approached him privately, urging him to consider running. "You're the reason we're doing this," one man told him. "If anyone deserves to lead, it's you." Though flattered, Steve hesitated. Leading the charge against Monroe had been one thing, but taking on a long-term role felt like a bigger commitment. Still, when Laura reminded him that he wouldn't be alone, he'd have support from the entire community, he finally agreed to give it a try. On the day of the election, nearly every household in Willow Creek turned out to vote. The atmosphere was festive, with music playing softly in the background and tables set up offering snacks and lemonade. Candidates gave short speeches explaining why they wanted to serve on the board, and voters cast their ballots anonymously using paper slips, collected in a large glass jar. When the votes were counted, Steve was elected president of the new HOA board. Laura became vice president, and Jake joined as treasurer, tasked with keeping a close eye on finances. Other seats went to a mix of longtime residents and newcomers, reflecting the diversity of the neighborhood. Their first official meeting as a board took place a week later. Unlike the tense, secretive sessions under Monroe's leadership, this one was held outdoors in the local park. Chairs were arranged in a circle, encouraging open dialogue. Residents were invited to attend and voice their opinions directly. "We're here to serve you," Steve began, looking around at the smiling faces. "From now on, every decision we make will prioritize fairness, transparency, and respect for individual property rights." The board spent hours discussing changes to the HOA rules. They eliminated outdated restrictions, like the ban on certain flower colors and RV parking limits. Instead, they focused on practical improvements, such as better street lighting, regular maintenance of common areas, and hosting annual block parties to strengthen community bonds. One of the biggest victories came when they officially declared that residents could use their pools whenever they wanted, without fear of fines or penalties. The announcement drew cheers from the crowd, especially from parents who loved watching their kids splash around on hot summer days. As weeks turned into months, the transformation in Willow Creek became undeniable. Neighbors who had once avoided each other now chatted regularly over fences or shared meals in their driveways. Community projects flourished, from planting flower gardens to organizing charity fundraisers. Even the local newspaper wrote a feature article praising the neighborhood for its newfound spirit of cooperation. For Steve, life returned to a semblance of normalcy, though it was richer and more fulfilling than before. He still enjoyed quiet afternoons floating in his pool, but now he did so knowing that his actions had sparked meaningful change. Whenever he looked around at the vibrant, happy community surrounding him, he felt a deep sense of pride. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Steve sat by the pool with Laura and Jake. The three reflected on everything they'd accomplished together. "I never thought standing up to the HOA would lead to this," Steve admitted, shaking his head in amazement. "It started with something so small, just wanting to swim in my own pool. And look where it's taken us," Laura said with a smile. "Sometimes fighting for what's right isn't just about winning. It's about inspiring others to believe they can make a difference too." Jake nodded, raising his soda can in a mock toast. "To new beginnings," he said, "and to proving that even the little guy can take down the big bully." They clinked their cans together, laughing as fireflies began to dance in the twilight. Willow Creek wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was a place where people cared about each other and worked together to build a better future. And for Steve Rogers, that was worth every moment of struggle. Months had passed since the dramatic showdown with Richard Monroe and the overhaul of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. Life in the neighborhood had settled into a rhythm that was both familiar and refreshingly new. Gone were the days of fear and frustration. Instead, residents embraced a spirit of cooperation and mutual respect. For Steve Rogers, this transformation was more rewarding than he could have ever imagined. On a quiet summer evening, Steve sat by his pool, enjoying the cool breeze and watching the sun dip below the horizon. The golden light painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, casting a warm glow over his backyard. It was moments like these that reminded him why he had fought so hard to reclaim his freedom, and the freedom of his neighbors. Laura joined him shortly after, carrying a tray of homemade cookies and 2 glasses of lemonade. She set the tray down on a small table between their chairs and took a seat, sighing happily as she looked around. "You know," she said, her voice soft but thoughtful, "I never thought I'd see Willow Creek like this. People actually care about each other now. It's amazing what a little rebellion can do." Steve chuckled, taking a sip of his drink. "Rebellion? Is that what we call it now? I thought we were just standing up for ourselves." "Call it what you want," Laura replied with a wink. "But you started something special here, Steve. You showed everyone that they didn't have to accept unfair treatment. And look at us now, a real community." Steve nodded, feeling a swell of pride. He hadn't set out to become a leader or a symbol of change, but somehow, that's exactly what had happened. What began as a personal battle against absurd rules had evolved into a movement that united the entire neighborhood. Now, Willow Creek thrived under its new leadership, with decisions made collectively and transparently. The HOA board meetings were no longer dreaded events attended only by a handful of people. Instead, they were lively gatherings where residents shared ideas and worked together to solve problems. Whether it was organizing seasonal festivals, improving streetlights, or planting trees along the sidewalks, everyone pitched in to make the neighborhood better. Even Jake Miller had found his place within the community. His online platform, which allowed residents to communicate and vote on important issues, became a cornerstone of the new system. Neighbors praised its convenience and transparency, often joking that Jake should run for mayor if he ever got tired of being treasurer. As the weeks went by, Steve noticed subtle changes not just in the neighborhood but also in himself. He felt more connected to those around him, more invested in their happiness. Hosting barbecues and pool parties had become a regular part of his routine, bringing people together in ways he hadn't anticipated. Children laughed as they splashed in the water, while parents chatted nearby, sharing stories and advice. One day, inspired by everything that had happened, Steve decided to start a blog. He called it Standing Up for Your Slice of Paradise, and it quickly gained traction among homeowners across the country who faced similar struggles with their own HOAs. Through his posts, Steve offered practical tips on how to challenge unjust rules, document evidence of corruption, and rally support from neighbors. Readers flooded his inbox with messages of gratitude, thanking him for giving them hope and guidance. "I didn't expect this," Steve admitted to Laura one afternoon as they reviewed some of the comments. "People are saying my story inspired them to fight back. It's surreal." "It's not surreal," Laura said firmly. "It's proof that standing up for yourself matters. You gave them permission to believe they could win." Though Steve appreciated the praise, he knew the credit belonged to everyone who had joined the cause. Without Laura's wisdom, Jake's tech skills, and the courage of countless neighbors, none of it would have been possible. Together, they had created something extraordinary, a true sense of belonging. As autumn approached, the neighborhood prepared for its annual fall festival, a tradition revived thanks to the new HOA board. Residents worked side by side to decorate the park with pumpkins, hay bales, and strings of lights. Children helped paint signs while adults coordinated games and food stalls. The event promised to be the biggest yet, drawing visitors from neighboring communities. On the day of the festival, Steve stood near the entrance, greeting attendees with a wide smile. Families strolled through the park, enjoying the crisp air and festive atmosphere. Music played softly in the background, and the smell of caramel apples and roasted corn filled the air. Laura walked up beside him, handing him a cup of hot cider. "Feels good, doesn't it?" she asked, nodding toward the happy crowd. "It does," Steve replied, his voice tinged with emotion. "This is what it's all about. People coming together, having fun, and supporting each other. We've come a long way." Laura patted his shoulder affectionately. "And there's still more to come. Who knows what else we'll accomplish?" Steve glanced around at the smiling faces, the laughter of children, and the sense of unity that permeated every corner of Willow Creek. For the first time in years, he felt truly at peace. The fight against the HOA had taught him that sometimes standing up for yourself isn't just about winning. It's about creating something better for everyone. As the sun set over the park, painting the sky in vibrant colors, Steve realized how much he had grown. He wasn't just a man fighting for his right to swim in his own pool anymore. He was part of something bigger, a community built on trust, fairness, and resilience. And as he watched the fireworks light up the night sky, Steve knew one thing for certain: whatever challenges lay ahead, Willow Creek would face them together.